My husband left for another woman and said, "You'll be left with nothing. I'll take the house." My lawyer shouted, "Fight!" But I quietly signed everything. He celebrated for a month, but he forgot that the house was actually... Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I should have seen it coming. Looking back now, from the quiet of my porch on a Tuesday morning, with coffee warming my hands and the Tennessee hills turning gold in October, I can trace every thread of the unraveling to its exact beginning. But that's the cruelest trick of hindsight. It arrives too late to be useful and too clear to be merciful. My name is Carol Whitfield. I was 43 years old when my marriage ended, 44 when I understood what ending a marriage actually meant, and 45 when I won. Daniel and I had been married for 19 years. We met at the University of Tennessee, where I was studying accounting, and he was studying how to charm people out of their better judgment. I mean that only half as a joke. Daniel Whitfield had a gift, a real, genuine gift, for making you feel like the most important person in any room. When he aimed that gift at me, I was 23 and unused to being seen. We married 4 years later in a small ceremony at my parents' farm in Sevier County. My mother wore lavender. His mother wore white, which told you everything you needed to know about her, but I didn't read the sign. We built our life methodically and with patience. I worked as a senior accountant at a regional firm for 15 years, rising to partner. Daniel ran a mid-size landscaping company that he'd inherited from his father and grown genuinely well. He was good at business, I'll give him that. We bought our house in 2009 during the crash when prices were low and our savings were intact. The house on Clover Ridge Road. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a wraparound porch that I painted myself, and an acre and a half of land that sloped gently toward a creek. I picked it. I negotiated it. I carried 40% of the down payment from an inheritance left to me by my grandmother, Edna Louise Byrne, who had kept her money in a coffee can under the kitchen sink and trusted no one but me with its location. We had no children. This is relevant. This became very relevant. The first sign, the real first sign, not the ones I invented in retrospect, came 18 months before Daniel told me anything. He started going to the gym at 6 in the morning. Daniel had never been a morning person. He'd fought alarm clocks his whole life with theatrical groaning and buried face protests. But suddenly, he was up at 5:30, showered, and gone. I told myself it was a health kick. A lot of men his age started caring about their bodies. I was glad of it even. I thought it was growth. The second sign was the phone. Not that he hid it. He was smarter than that, or she was. But he'd started angling the screen away from me when he typed, the way you angle a test paper away from a classmate. A subtle rotation of the wrist. I noticed it the way you notice a new sound in your car engine. Once, then twice. Then you can't stop hearing it. The third sign was Sandra Kowalski. Sandra had been Daniel's office manager for 3 years. I'd met her at 2 Christmas parties and a company barbecue. She was 36, trim, with the kind of highlighted blonde hair that requires serious maintenance and serious intention. She laughed at everything Daniel said. At the barbecue, I'd watched her laugh at something he said about mulch. About mulch? I'd noticed it the way you notice a slightly wrong note in a song. Not alarming, just slightly off-key. By November of that year, Daniel was taking his phone into the bathroom at night. I said nothing. I watched. This is something people don't understand about me. I am an accountant. I spent 20 years reading numbers that other people thought were too complicated for anyone to examine. Every discrepancy tells a story, if you learn to listen. I was learning to listen. Then one evening in February, I came home early from a client dinner that ended ahead of schedule. The house was dark except for the kitchen light. Daniel was at the island, his back to me, talking quietly into his phone. He didn't hear me come in. I stood in the hallway for 11 seconds. I counted. And I heard him say, in a voice I recognized from our early years, "She won't be a problem. The house is as good as ours." He turned and saw me. The phone disappeared into his pocket in one smooth motion. "Who was that?" I asked. "Client," he said. "Landscaping bid." He smiled. He walked over and kissed my cheek. He smelled like fresh cologne at 9 o'clock in the evening, in our kitchen, on a Tuesday in February. I smiled back. But something inside me had gone very still and very cold, the way a creek goes silent just before it freezes. That night, I couldn't sleep. Daniel fell asleep within minutes. The unbothered sleep of a man who either had nothing to hide or had hidden things so long they no longer troubled him. I lay beside him in the dark and did what I do best. I calculated. I went through it systematically, the way I'd approach an audit. The gym. The phone. Sandra laughing at the mulch joke. The cologne. And most importantly, the house is as good as ours. Ours. Not his. Ours. That plural pronoun used in a conversation he didn't know I'd heard with a client who booked landscaping bids at 9 in the evening, using the voice Daniel once used to tell me he loved me. By 2 in the morning, I knew. Not suspected. Knew. And with knowing came the particular kind of grief that has no theatrical component. No crying, no shaking. Just a steady, quiet disassembly of everything you thought was real. I got up at 4, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and started making a list. Assets. The house on Clover Ridge Road. Current estimated value, $480,000. Daniel's landscaping business. He'd always kept the books personally, which I had never questioned, and now questioned loudly in my own mind. 2 cars. Joint savings account, $94,000. My separate retirement account, $210,000 in my name only. His separate retirement account, amount unknown to me. My accounting partnership stake. I worked in the silence of that kitchen for 2 hours. The furnace clicked on, the refrigerator hummed, and the thing that kept circling back, pressing like a thumb against a bruise, was something I knew from 19 years of financial work. The house on Clover Ridge Road. We had bought it for $312,000 in 2009. I had contributed $68,000 from my grandmother Edna's inheritance toward the down payment. Documented, wire transferred, bank recorded. The remaining 30% had come from our joint account. My name was on the mortgage. My name was on the deed. But Tennessee is not a community property state. It's an equitable distribution state. And in an equitable distribution state, what a judge considers equitable depends on a great many things, including things like who lived in the house, who contributed what, and, critically, whether anyone had done anything to deceive the other. I set down my coffee cup. I am an accountant. I know how paper trails work. I know how they can be constructed and how they can be destroyed. If Daniel had been planning this, and that phone call suggested he had been planning this with Sandra as a partnership, then he might already be moving money. Landscaping companies deal heavily in cash. Business accounts can be drained with the right paperwork and just enough time. I calculated, perhaps a few months before he made his move. I didn't cry. I got up, washed my cup, and went back upstairs. I lay down beside my husband in the dark and I made a decision. I would not confront him. Not yet. Not before I knew everything there was to know. Because in every audit I'd ever performed, the worst thing you could do was tip off the subject before you'd collected your evidence. Instead, I would become invisible. I would be the Carol he thought he knew. Pleasant, trusting, slightly distracted by work. And while he arranged his next life with Sandra Kowalski, I would be doing something far more useful. I would be building mine. 2 days later, I called Margaret Chen. Margaret Chen had been my closest friend since graduate school, and she happened to be one of the best divorce attorneys in Knoxville. I did not call her from my cell phone. I drove to a gas station 3 miles from my house, bought a prepaid phone with cash, and called her from the parking lot. "Margaret," I said when she picked up, "I need to know what I don't know." There was a pause. And then Margaret, who had sat across from me at the finish line of 15 marathons I never ran and 3 breakdowns I did, said, "Tell me everything." I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "Carol, the house, whose name is on the deed?" "Both of ours," I said. "But Margaret, the $68,000 from my grandmother, I have every record." Another pause, longer this time. "Then we have a starting point," she said. "But Carol, I need you to do something for me. I need you to find out what he's moving and when." I already had a plan for that. Because the one thing Daniel had never understood in 19 years of marriage was that I had been the one paying attention to the money all along. The next 8 weeks were the loneliest and most productive of my life. I worked. I came home. I cooked dinner. I watched television beside Daniel on the couch, his thigh warm against mine, and I felt nothing, which was worse than feeling something. Nothing is the sound a wire makes before it snaps. On weekday mornings, before Daniel woke, I photographed every financial document in the house with my prepaid phone. Mortgage statements, tax returns from the past 7 years, the deed, insurance paperwork. I had learned in 20 years of accounting that the most important documents are the ones nobody thinks to hide because nobody imagines anyone will look. I found the first concrete thing on a Thursday in March. Daniel kept his business records in a locked filing cabinet in the garage, locked with a combination I'd never needed because I'd never needed it. But 19 years of marriage teaches you things. I knew he used combinations of dates, his mother's birthday, the founding date of his business, his parents' anniversary. The third one opened it. Inside the cabinet, behind the current year files, were 3 years of quarterly profit reports for Whitfield Landscaping. I'd never seen them. Daniel had always handled the business finances separately, which I'd respected as his domain. But an accountant looking at profit statements for the first time sees things a non-accountant misses. The numbers were wrong. Not fraudulently wrong, not criminally wrong, not yet, or not obviously. But the profit margins in the most recent 6 quarters were suppressed in a way that experienced eyes recognize. Delayed invoicing, inflated subcontractor payments, deferred revenue. Classic strategies for making a business appear to earn less than it does, right before a significant financial event. Like a divorce. I photographed everything. I sent the photos to Margaret. Then I put everything back in exact order, relocked the cabinet, and went inside to make Daniel's coffee. Margaret called me back within 48 hours. "He's preparing," she said. "This is asset obscuring. It's not always illegal, but it's absolutely relevant to equitable distribution. I need you to do one more thing." "What?" "The house deed. Pull the full title history. I need to know if he's done anything to the deed recently. Any transfers. Any liens he may have placed without your signature." I requested the title search through the county register's office myself, as a matter of professional research. I had legitimate reasons, as a CPA, to request such documents. The results came back in 5 business days. Nothing had been moved. Yet. The deed read exactly as it always had. Carol Jean Whitfield and Daniel Scott Whitfield as tenants by the entirety. But there was something else in the file. a document I hadn't expected. A quitclaim deed, prepared but not filed. It had been drafted by a local real estate attorney 4 months ago. It would have transferred full title to Daniel Scott Whitfield alone, removing my name, pending my signature. My signature that had never been requested. My signature that had been forged. Not filed, but prepared. Ready. Waiting for a moment of chaos or confusion and this was the interpretation that settled over me like cold water. Waiting for a confrontation in which I might be pressured to sign something I didn't fully read. I sat in my car in the county office parking lot for 15 minutes before I could drive. Then I photographed the document. I called Margaret. "He forged your signature on a preparatory quitclaim?" Her voice was very quiet. "It wasn't filed," I said. "But it exists." A silence. Then Margaret said very precisely, "Carol, do not go home and act differently. Do not confront him. I'm calling Rick Heller in the DA's office first thing tomorrow morning. Preparing a fraudulent deed, even an unfiled one, is a criminal matter in Tennessee. But more importantly, this is our point of no return. We're past gathering information. We're building a case." I drove home. I made dinner. I watched Daniel eat the pasta I'd cooked and talk about a bid he was putting together for a commercial property in Maryville, and I nodded at the right moments and refilled his water glass when it was low. And I understood, with a clarity I had never felt before in my life, that I was no longer the person Daniel thought I was. I had become something he hadn't prepared for. Margaret filed the divorce petition on a Monday morning in April. I was not home when Daniel received the service papers. I was at my office, sitting at my desk, doing the work I had done for 20 years, with a cup of lukewarm coffee and a client file open in front of me. My paralegal, Denise, who knew only that something significant was happening in my personal life, kept my afternoon clear. Margaret called me at 2:17. "He's been served," she said. "Okay," I said. "His attorney is Robert Van. Van is aggressive. Be prepared." I already knew Robert Van by reputation. Every attorney in Knoxville did. He handled high-conflict divorces for high-net-worth clients, and he operated on the principle that the louder and more overwhelming the pressure, the faster the other side would fold. He was good at his job, which meant I needed to be better at mine. That evening, Daniel came home at 7. He stood in the kitchen doorway with the divorce papers in his hand and his face doing something complicated. Anger and calculation fighting each other for the dominant expression. "You filed," he said. "Yes," I said. "Why didn't you talk to me first?" "I thought about it," I said. "I decided this was better." He set the papers on the counter. "Carol, this isn't what you think. Whatever you think is happening." "Daniel," I said, "I don't need you to explain anything." Something shifted in his face. The calculation won. "You know Van is going to go after your partnership stake, the firm's equity." "I know. And the house." He stopped. Reset. "The house is marital property. We bought it together." "We did," I said, "with $68,000 of my grandmother's inheritance, plus our joint funds." I paused. "I have the wire transfer records." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he picked up the papers and walked out. That night, he called Sandra. I know this because I was no longer naive about where his calls went. I didn't listen. I didn't need to. The architecture of what came next was already clear. Van's first move came 4 days later, a motion arguing that the house was marital property subject to equal division, that Daniel's contribution to the mortgage payments over 14 years constituted primary financial responsibility, and that the $68,000 inheritance had been commingled into the marital estate and was therefore no longer separate property. It was a solid argument. Not winning, but solid enough to frighten someone who didn't know what I knew. Van scheduled a settlement conference 3 weeks out. Daniel arrived with Sandra at the law offices. She sat in the waiting area, visible from the conference room, which was theatrical and intentional. He wanted me to see her there. He wanted the visual to do work on me. I sat beside Margaret and looked at my notes. Van opened by laying out their position on the house. Equitable split. Current market value, approximately $510,000. Each party would receive approximately $255,000 after costs, or the house would be sold and proceeds divided. Then he paused for effect. Or, given the complexity of the business valuation and Mrs. Whitfield's partnership interest, we would consider a global settlement in which Mrs. Whitfield receives her partnership stake undisputed and Mr. Whitfield retains the property. Margaret was about to speak. I put my hand on her arm. I looked at Van. I looked at Daniel. "No," I said. Van leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'd encourage you to consider—" "No," I said again. "And I'd encourage you, Mr. Van, to speak with your client about certain documents that exist in the county register's office. A quitclaim deed, prepared 4 months ago, bearing what appears to be my signature, a signature I did not provide." The silence in the conference room was total. Daniel's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. The color left it, not slowly, immediately, like a shade being pulled. Van turned to Daniel. Daniel said nothing. "We'll need a brief recess," Van said. "Of course," Margaret said, with the pleasantness of someone holding all the cards. We stepped into the hallway. Margaret squeezed my arm. I walked to the window and looked out at the Knoxville skyline and breathed carefully because my hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the specific physical response of a body that has been holding tension for months and has just released the first piece of it. 3 days later, Van withdrew from the case. 2 days after that, Daniel called me, not at home, but on the prepaid number he'd found in my car, which told me he'd been through my car, which told me more about who he was than anything else in this story. "You need to back down," he said. "You don't know what I can do." "Goodbye, Daniel," I said, and ended the call. Then I drove to my mother's house in Sevier County and sat on her porch for 3 days and let myself rest. I ate soup. I watched the mountains. I didn't look at my phone more than necessary. I had earned those 3 days. My mother, Frances Byrne Whitfield, she'd never changed her name back after my father passed because she said it was too much paperwork, and besides, she didn't mind being a Whitfield. It was me she was keeping. Made biscuits every morning and didn't ask questions I hadn't answered yet. On the second day, she set a cup of tea in front of me and said, "You know what your grandmother used to say?" "Tell me." She said, "The woman who waits has already won." My mother sat down across from me. Edna Louise said that when she found out my father had tried to deed her house out from under her in 1962. Different era, different methods, same kind of man. I looked at her. Did she win? My mother smiled. She outlived him by 23 years and kept the house. She patted my hand. "Drink your tea." But the world had not stopped while I sat on my mother's porch. Daniel had hired a new attorney, a woman named Patricia Oakes, who had a reputation for being less theatrical than Van, but considerably sharper. And Sandra Kowalski, it turned out, had a reputation of her own. While I was in Sevier County, a mutual acquaintance, Teresa Park, who ran the bookkeeping for 3 local businesses and knew everyone, called me on a Wednesday morning with information I hadn't asked for, but needed. "Carol," she said, "I don't know if you know this, but Sandra's been telling people you're going to walk away with nothing. She's already picking out furniture. She posted on a private Facebook group I'm in, she thinks it's private, that she's going to be living on Clover Ridge Road by Christmas." The coldness I felt was not anger. I was past anger by then. It was something cleaner, a steady, technical certainty. "Teresa," I said, "do you have access to that post? Can you take a screenshot?" "Already sent it to your email," she said. "Your real email, not the one on your business card. The one you gave me for the charity auction." That screenshot was not legally significant in itself, but it was useful for what it confirmed. Sandra knew about the house. Sandra had been told the plan, which meant Sandra was not incidental to this situation. She was a participant in it. Margaret found this information very interesting. Meanwhile, the new attorney Patricia Oakes sent a written settlement proposal. It was intelligent and calibrated. Daniel would retain the house and pay Carol a lump sum of $180,000, representing what Oakes argued was Carol's equitable share after considering Daniel's 14 years of mortgage payments. The business valuation would be disputed separately. The letter was polite. The number was insulting. I sat at my mother's kitchen table and did the math. The house was worth $510,000. The mortgage balance remaining was $88,000. Net equity, $422,000. My grandmother's inheritance had been $68,000 of the original down payment, documented. Adjusted for appreciation, Margaret's financial expert had calculated my separate property claim as conservatively $145,000, plus half of the remaining marital equity. $180,000 was designed to look generous while being approximately 60 cents on the dollar. I wrote back a single line, through Margaret. "We will see you in court." Back in Knoxville, I found my social footing. Teresa Park connected me to a women's support group that met weekly at a Lutheran church downtown. Not a divorce group exactly, but a group of women in various kinds of transition, which amounts to the same thing. I went once, expecting to feel pitied, and instead found 6 women who had navigated versions of my situation and had opinions about attorneys, financial disclosures, and the particular cruelty of men who assume that their wives haven't been paying attention. A woman named Gloria, who'd been through a contentious divorce 5 years earlier, took me aside after the first meeting. "The worst part," she said, "is when they come back pretending to want peace. They don't want peace. They want you to drop your guard." I filed that away. I didn't know then how soon I'd need it. They came in June. On a Saturday morning, which should have told me something. Saturday is chosen deliberately for home visits in delicate situations because the weekend carries a social softness, a suggestion of informality, an implication that this isn't official. People are less guarded on Saturdays. Their attorneys aren't available. The formal machinery of litigation feels far away. Daniel had always understood the psychology of timing, even if he'd never studied it formally. It was instinct with him, the same instinct that had made him a good salesman of his own company for 20 years. The doorbell rang at 10. Daniel stood on my porch, technically our porch, legally still our porch, with Sandra at his shoulder and a bottle of wine in his hand. White wine, in June, at 10 in the morning. The wine was theatrical. Everything Daniel did was theatrical. "Carol," he said, "can we talk?" I looked at them both. Sandra was wearing a soft blouse in dusty rose and what I recognized as careful, practiced casualness. The kind of casual that takes 45 minutes in front of a mirror. She looked like someone auditioning for the role of reasonable woman. Her earrings were small and pearl-colored, conservative, chosen to suggest sincerity. I noticed details like that. I had always noticed details like that. I opened the door wider. "Come in." We sat in the living room, not the kitchen. I chose the living room deliberately because the living room is more formal, more public feeling, less intimate. There would be no warmth performed here. No coffee offered, no biscuits, no gestures that suggested we were neighbors dropping by. I sat in the armchair rather than the sofa, the armchair that I had always preferred and Daniel had always commandeered, and I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Daniel set the wine on the coffee table. Nobody touched it. "We wanted to talk to you," he said. "Without attorneys. Just the three of us, as adults. Just the three of us." As if Sandra's presence here were a neutral fact rather than a calculated provocation. The other woman, in the home she'd been promised, looking at the furniture she'd already picked out in that private Facebook post that Teresa Park had screenshot and sent to my email. "All right," I said. "Talk." "This doesn't have to be what it's become," Daniel said. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and deployed the expression I recognized from 2 decades. The sincere face, the open face, the face that had once convinced me to trust him with my grandmother's money. "The court process is going to be brutal for both of us. Attorney's fees alone, Carol, we're going to burn through 2 years of equity." "That's possible," I said. "What we're proposing," Sandra said, and here she leaned forward too, mirroring Daniel, which told me they'd rehearsed this, "is a clean settlement. You take your retirement account, your partnership stake, and a fair cash amount. You move forward. We move forward. Nobody has to sit through 6 months of depositions." I looked at her steadily. What struck me, sitting across from her in my own living room, was how thoroughly she had constructed a narrative in which she was reasonable and I was the obstacle. She genuinely believed it, I think. People who want things badly enough always find a way to believe they deserve them. "What's the cash amount?" I said. Daniel named a number, $200,000. $20,000 more than Oaks had offered in writing. Designed to feel like a concession. Designed to feel like generosity. "And the house?" I said. "We keep the house," Daniel said, "which makes sense, given that you've already promised it to Sandra," I said. The room changed temperature. Sandra opened her mouth, closed it. Daniel's jaw tightened in the particular way it tightened when he was recalculating. I had watched that jaw tighten across 19 years of difficult conversations and business setbacks and the small daily frictions of a long marriage, and I knew exactly what it meant. "Carol," he said, his voice dropping into something softer and more dangerous. "You know I still care about you. 19 years means something. But if you take this to court, things are going to come out about your firm, questions about client accounts, about your partnership arrangements." I looked at him. I felt the air in the room shift. This was the part they'd been building toward the entire visit. The wine, the soft blouse, the reasonable voices. This was the point of it all. The settlement offer was the carrot. This was the stick. "Are you threatening me, Daniel?" I said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. He backtracked immediately. "It's not a threat, It sounds like a threat," I said. "And I want you to think carefully about making threats during active litigation. Margaret would find it very interesting. In fact, I find it very interesting right now, and I have a very good memory for detail." He stopped. He looked at me. Really looked at me, in a way he perhaps hadn't in years. Something passed across his face that I couldn't fully name. Not respect, exactly, but a recalibration. A dawning awareness that the Carol sitting in this armchair was not the Carol he had married, or the Carol he had planned around, or the Carol he had assumed would sign what was put in front of her. A silence fell that none of us filled. Sandra touched Daniel's arm. He stood. They were leaving, faster than they'd arrived, the casual Saturday softness entirely gone, the wine still untouched on my coffee table. Sandra turned at the door and looked at me with something that might have been contempt or might have been the beginning of uncertainty. I thought it was both. I thought those two things lived together in her more comfortably than she knew. "You're making a mistake," she said. "I make very few mistakes," I said. "Professionally speaking." The door closed. I sat alone in my living room for a long moment. My heart was beating faster than I wanted it to. I was frightened. Not of them, exactly, but of what people do when they realize their carefully arranged plan is unraveling. Cornered people are unpredictable. Desperate people take bigger swings. I thought about the forged deed, about the suppressed business accounts, about a man who had been constructing an exit strategy for at least 8 months before I'd known to look. A man like that, told that the exit strategy was failing, did not simply accept it. But the fear, I found, had a texture I didn't expect. It wasn't soft and collapsing, it was firm, structural, like the kind of fear you feel at the top of a ladder. Not paralyzing, but clarifying. It told me exactly how much this mattered. It told me exactly how much to fight. The hearing was set for a Thursday in September. Department 4, Knox County Circuit Court, the Honorable Judge Miriam Talley presiding. Judge Talley was 61 years old, had been on the bench for 14 years, and had the demeanor of a woman who had heard every possible variation of human financial deception and found each one somewhat less surprising than the last. She had a reputation for patience in proceedings and zero tolerance for courtroom theater. She did not appreciate drama. She appreciated documentation. This, Margaret had told me, was exactly the kind of judge we wanted. "She'll read every exhibit," Margaret said. "Everyone. And she'll remember them." I dressed carefully that morning. Dark gray suit, pearl earrings my mother had given me, flat shoes for practicality. I was not performing grief. I was not performing outrage. I was performing competence, because competence was what this required. I had slept adequately. Not well, but adequately. And eaten breakfast, which was a discipline rather than an appetite. The courthouse smelled, as courthouses always do, of old carpet and institutional coffee. I had been in courtrooms before as a financial expert witness, testifying on audit findings in civil cases. I was not unfamiliar with the mechanics, the formality, the procedural rhythms, the way time moves differently inside those rooms, more deliberately, as if the building itself insists on caution. I found it that morning oddly steadying. Patricia Oakes sat with Daniel at the opposite table. He wore a blue suit I recognized. He'd bought it for his cousin's wedding 3 years ago. He looked tired, which was fair. The discovery process had not been comfortable for him. Oakes had requested a continuance twice and been granted it once, which meant she too had been managing complications she hadn't anticipated when she took the case. She was still polished, still precise. But the confidence she'd projected in her initial filings had a slightly different quality now, more careful, less expansive. She had learned things in the course of this case that required managing. Sandra was not in the courtroom. Her absence was conspicuous. I had half expected her. She had been present at the initial settlement conference, the visible statement of intent. But she wasn't here. I wondered whether it had been Oakes's advice or Daniel's decision. Either way, her absence felt like an acknowledgement that something had shifted. The hearing began with Oakes presenting Daniel's position on the house. She was precise, professional, and argued the 14-year mortgage payment history persuasively. Daniel had paid $2,100 per month for 14 years, she noted, representing over $350,000 in contributions to the marital home. She cited the relevant case law on equitable distribution in Tennessee, framed Daniel's contributions as primary and substantial, and argued that the inheritance funds, having been transferred into a joint account, had been commingled into marital property and lost their separate character. It was a solid argument. Margaret had prepared me for every piece of it, solid enough to frighten someone who didn't know what I knew, but not solid enough to hold against what we were about to show. Then Margaret stood. She began with the deed history, the title search, the unfiled quitclaim deed bearing what expert handwriting analysis, obtained in the last 45 days at no small expense from a certified forensic document examiner based in Nashville, had determined was a signature showing significant inconsistency with Carol Whitfield's documented signing patterns across 14 verified authentic signatures from the same period. Oakes objected on foundation grounds. Judge Talley overruled, admitted the expert report, and asked the examiner's credentials be entered into the record. They were extensive. Margaret presented the financial expert's report on Whitfield Landscaping, 3 years of quarterly statements showing suppressed profit margins in the 6 quarters preceding the divorce filing. The methodology was explained clearly, precisely, without drama. Deferred invoicing, inflated subcontractor payments, revenue recognition delays. Each specific entry was flagged. The total suppressed revenue over the relevant period was calculated at approximately $180,000, money that had existed but been made to appear not to exist in the period immediately before a significant marital financial event. Daniel wrote something on a notepad. Oakes looked at it. Her expression did not change, but her posture shifted slightly. A micro-adjustment, the kind you only catch if you've spent 20 years watching people react to numbers they hadn't expected to be in the room. The adjustment said, "I was not given all of the information I needed to fully prepare this case." She had not been. That was Daniel's doing, not hers. But it was her problem now. Then Margaret introduced the $68,000. The wire transfer records from 2009, direct from my grandmother Edna's estate account to the joint purchase account, not a personal account, not a commingled savings account used for daily expenses, but an account opened specifically and solely to hold funds for the home purchase. Documented with a letter from the estate attorney, identifying the funds explicitly as an inheritance passed directly to Carol Jean Whitfield, and with the estate account closing statement showing the full transfer in a single transaction, not deposited gradually, not mixed with payroll. One transfer, one purpose, one paper trail. Tennessee courts recognize inherited funds as separate property when they can be traced with specificity, Margaret said. Mrs. Whitfield can trace them precisely. To the account, to the date, to the attorney letter, to the deed of purchase. The commingling doctrine applies when tracing becomes impossible. Here, it is entirely possible. Judge Talley looked at the documents in front of her for a long moment. She looked at Daniel. She looked at Patricia Oakes. "Counselor," she said to Oakes, "has your client provided a complete accounting of Whitfield Landscaping's financials for the period in question?" A pause. The pause itself was an answer. "We've provided the documents identified in the discovery request." "A complete accounting," Judge Talley repeated. She said it without raised volume or altered tone. The repetition was its own sufficient emphasis. "I'll give you the opportunity to supplement the record before I issue my ruling. You'll have 14 days. It was, I understood, not a kindness. It was the judicial equivalent of giving someone enough rope and the time to decide what to do with it. And then Daniel did something that no attorney, however skilled, could have prevented, because it came from who he was rather than what he'd prepared. He spoke. "Judge," he said. Oakes's hand moved immediately toward his arm. "If I could just explain. The business figures reflect legitimate accounting decisions made in the ordinary course." "Mr. Whitfield," Judge Talley said, with the patience of someone who had heard this particular sentence in various forms, many times, "you have counsel. Please consult her." But he kept going. Half a sentence more, something about timing and standard consulting decisions, before Oakes's hand closed on his arm firmly enough that he stopped mid-word. Half a sentence was enough. In the wrong direction, half a sentence is always enough. It was the kind of thing an experienced judge files away, not as formal evidence but as character. The reflexive need to explain, the inability to sit quietly inside an unflattering silence, the impulse to manage a narrative even when the correct move is stillness. And character in an equitable distribution proceeding is not legally irrelevant. A judge asked to determine what is equitable will always be reading the people in the room as well as the documents on the table. I looked at my hands, flat on the table in front of me. I did not look at Daniel. I did not look at Oakes. I did not look at Judge Talley. I looked at my hands, and I breathed. And for the first time in 18 months, I felt something that was not fear, not calculation, and not grief. It was quieter than all of those. It was the feeling of a column that has been balanced, not yet confirmed, not yet closed, but balanced. The arithmetic checks. The logic holds. I did the right things, in the right order, and it is going to hold. Judge Talley issued her ruling 22 days later in a written order that Margaret read to me over the phone. I was sitting in my car in the parking garage of my office building, and I listened without taking notes, which was unusual for me, but I couldn't write and hear at the same time. Not for this. The house on Clover Ridge Road was awarded to Carol Jean Whitfield. Not split. Not sold. Awarded. The court found that the $68,000 inheritance was traceable separate property and awarded Carol credit for it in full. The court further found that the suppression of business profits in the pre-divorce period was relevant to equitable distribution and adjusted the marital asset calculations accordingly. The court noted the existence of the unfiled quitclaim deed and, in careful judicial language that said exactly what it needed to say without exceeding the bounds of the civil proceeding, found it concerning and relevant to the court's assessment of credibility. Daniel was awarded the landscaping business, valued at its full fair market rate, which ironically was higher than he'd been representing, since the suppressed profits had to be restored to the calculation. He received the business, his retirement account, and a 50% share of the joint savings. I received the house, my retirement account, my partnership stake, my full separate property credit, and a cash equalization payment of $47,000. The forged deed was separately referred to the district attorney's office. I did not pursue criminal charges personally. Margaret advised that the civil proceedings outcome was secured and the referral alone was sufficient consequence. I agreed. I did not want to spend another year in a courtroom. I wanted to go home. To my home. I drove to Clover Ridge Road that afternoon. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the wraparound porch I'd painted myself in 2010, a Saturday project that had taken 2 weekends and left me with paint in my hair for a month. The paint had been refreshed since then. I'd done it again in 2018, a different white, slightly warmer. I knew every board of that porch. I knew where the boards were sound and where they would eventually need replacing. I'd been planning to fix the northeast corner the following spring. Now I would. I called Daniel once, he didn't answer, and left a message that contained only logistics: the date by which his remaining belongings needed to be removed, the arrangements for the key, the utilities switchover. I kept it to 40 seconds and spoke with the same tone I used for client voicemails. He had called me once more, 2 weeks before the ruling, to say that I was destroying him and that I would regret this. I had said, quietly, "I regret many things, Daniel. This isn't one of them." Then I changed my number. Margaret, in her professional capacity, sent her final invoice, which I paid promptly, and to which I added a handwritten note that said only, "Thank you for believing the numbers," because that was what she had done. She had believed me when I said the numbers were wrong, and in our world, that is the most important thing a person can do for you. Teresa Park threw a small dinner. 6 women, a table in her backyard, string lights, wine that we actually drank. Gloria, from the support group, raised her glass and said, "To women who read the fine print." We drank to that. I drove home to Clover Ridge Road in the September dark, with the windows down and the Tennessee air coming through warm and smelling of cut grass, and I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The lights I'd left on glowed through the windows. The porch wrapped around the house the way it always had, wide and generous, the way my grandmother Edna had believed a porch should be, which is why I'd known, the first time I'd seen this house, that it was mine. I went inside. I locked the door. The northeast corner of the porch, as I had predicted, needed new boards. I hired a contractor in October, a quiet man named Russ who showed up exactly when he said he would and charged exactly what he'd quoted, and watched the work from the kitchen window while I drank my first cup of coffee. When he finished, I walked the length of the repaired section and pressed my heel into each new board in turn. They were solid. The wood smelled clean and raw in the October air, and I stood there longer than I needed to, just feeling the soundness of it underfoot. I spent that fall reclaiming spaces. Not in any dramatic sense. I didn't repaint every room or perform the kind of wholesale reinvention that people do in movies after difficult endings. I moved a chair from the guest room to the study because I'd always preferred it there, and Daniel had said it blocked the light, which it did slightly, but the light was fine and the chair was better there. I rehung 3 pictures that had been in storage because Daniel found them fussy. I bought a small rug for the kitchen in a color he would have called too bright, which was precisely why I bought it. Small things. But small things accumulate into the texture of a life. And for the first time in a long time, the texture of my life was being shaped entirely by my own hand. I started cooking differently. For years, I'd calibrated dinner toward Daniel's preferences. Heavy on red meat, light on spice. The same rotation of reliable meals that a long marriage produces like a kind of gravitational pull. I discovered, at 45, that I prefer things bright and sharp and a little hot. I made a green curry on a Tuesday night in November and ate it standing at the kitchen island, listening to music I'd chosen, and it was one of the better meals of my life, which tells you something about the relationship between freedom and flavor. My partnership at the firm deepened. My caseload shifted. More complex clients, higher stakes audits, a referral from a Nashville firm who'd heard I was thorough and unflappable under pressure. I had spent 18 months being exactly that. It turned out those were marketable qualities. In the spring, I joined a hiking group because Gloria from the support group invited me, and because I had decided to say yes to things the previous version of my life had made logistically difficult. Saturdays had always belonged to a shared domestic rhythm that someone else set the tempo for. Now, I set my own tempo. The first real hike I did was 6 miles in the Smokies, on a trail that climbed steadily before opening onto a ridge with a view that made the climb feel like an entirely fair transaction. I was terrible at it. My legs ached, my breathing was undignified, and Gloria, 8 years older than me, waited at the top of the hard sections with the patience of someone who understood that being new at something is not the same as being bad at it permanently. At the top, I stood in the wind and looked at the mountains rolling away in every direction and felt, with a completeness I hadn't expected, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I started seeing someone in December, a man named Paul, who taught high school history and had the calm, slightly distracted quality of someone whose inner life is genuinely interesting to him. We met at a dinner party at Teresa Parks' house, where he'd argued cheerfully about the historiography of Reconstruction, and I found myself genuinely engaged rather than politely attentive, which was a distinction I'd forgotten, mattered. We went slowly, which suited me. Rushing, I had come to understand, is almost always a form of fear. And Daniel? Daniel moved into a rental property in West Knoxville with Sandra in October, a 3-bedroom house in a development that was perfectly adequate and looked nothing like Clover Ridge Road. I had no interest in monitoring his life. I had enough of my own. What I heard, I heard through Teresa Park, who shared things with me not out of gossip, but out of the loyalty of a woman who had watched a friend go through something hard and wanted her to know that the architecture of the other side had not held. The landscaping business, its financials now fully on the books, was considerably less profitable than Sandra had been led to believe. The income she'd imagined had relied on the creative accounting practices the court's financial expert had unwound. Clean books produced accurate numbers, significantly less flattering than the figures Sandra had been shown when she was deciding whether this future was worth pursuing. By spring, she had begun asking pointed questions about the finances. Daniel did not enjoy being asked direct questions about money by the person he lived with. By early summer, she was consulting a professional of her own, the kind you consult when you believe financial information has been misrepresented to you in the context of a significant personal decision. I felt no satisfaction in hearing this. The truth is more neutral. I felt the quiet closing of an account. The final line of a ledger opened too long. Balance confirmed, column closed, book shut. The quitclaim matter remained with the DA's office, moving carefully, without drama. I had been told to expect contact as a witness eventually. I was prepared. I had always been prepared to tell the truth about documented facts. My grandmother, Edna Louise Byrne, had kept her money in a coffee can under the kitchen sink because she believed that money belonging to a woman should remain under a woman's control. She'd been right in 1962. The arrangements had improved since, imperfectly, incrementally. But the underlying principle, knowing exactly what you have and keeping the documentation close, remained as sound as it had ever been. I keep a photograph of her on the mantel in the living room. In it, she's standing on a porch that looks nothing like mine in 1974, wearing a print dress and squinting slightly into the sun, with an expression that says she is thinking about something and she fully expects to win. Every morning when I pass it on my way to the kitchen, I think, yes, exactly that. What did I learn from all of this? Keep your records. Know your numbers. Understand exactly what you own and why you own it. Because the moment you stop paying attention, someone else will start. What would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted him that night or waited? Leave your answer below. And thank you, truly, for listening.